Hello, my name is Rodríguez Arnaiz, and I'm a former student of Universidad Complutense de Madrid from the English Studies and American Studies Bachelor and Master's degree. I'm here to present my paper on how Marvel Comics Civil War, published between 2006 and 2007, exposes the crisis on the American identity present in the post-9/11 United States, and how that crisis, in a way, is also present even today in that society. If you give me just a moment, I will share with you my presentation. Okay. Great. Okay, Ever since comic books began to occupy the shelves of stores and homes all around the United States in the early 20th century, they have provided a space for entertainment as well as for social reflection. The impact of social matters on superhero tales is unquestionable, as the first timely comics, now Marvel Comics, began to publish the stories of Captain America fighting Nazis and punching Hitler while real American soldiers fought Nazism in Europe. Stan Lee, the man who, along with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, revolutionized the superhero world in the 1960s, declared that everything that is happening at the time a story is written has an effect on that story, whether an obvious one or a subliminal one. Their works, mainly directed at children and young readers, provided an age-appropriate portrayal of the current historical and social context, while also becoming a more socially conscious forum for young people to learn adult ideas. Indeed, it was until the 1970s and especially the 90s that authors began to include their critical views on historical and social matters in their stories, and it is in this context that Marvel Comics provided its authors with a space in which to freely develop their works and their critical views. The change was possible thanks in part to the changes in the readership, as some of the children who had begun to read comic books in the 60s and 70s had kept reading them as adults. And artists had, in fact, in this context and in this sense, to create stories that were both interesting enough for the adult readers and still an adequate reading material for the youth. In other words, comics were no longer children's media, but one that could reach all ages. It is in this context that the doors to the 21st century opened with one of the most relevant events in the recent history of the United States, the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Viewed as a moment of historical rupture, 9/11 supposed a turning point for Americans who had, prior to the attacks, perceived their nation as exceptional and invincible, thanks mainly to the advantageous geographical and political position of the US in the world, an illusion that disappeared on that fateful September morning. The event became the author's focus of attention also in the superhero world, where, although initially very patriotic and supportive of the official narrative, comic books were one of the first spaces of fiction to withdraw from this support of the official narrative promoted by authorities and mass media to become a place in which to challenge and criticize openly the policies promoted by the Bush administration as part of the so-called war on terror. And capturing in this sense within their pages some of the debates on civil rights and liberties that arose after 9/11. In this context, Marvel's most celebrated, most representative series was Mark Millar and Steve McNiven's Civil War, a 7-issue series published between 2006 and 2007. A clear allegory to the post-9/11 America, Civil War brings to light matters of privacy and freedom, central to some of the most controversial policies promoted by the Bush administration, such as the Patriot Act or the Homeland Security Act, measures that were developed and improved in a matter of weeks after the attack, with almost no opposition and virtually no debate, even though they gave law enforcement unprecedented powers to spy on all citizens. Mirroring this scenario where Civil War takes place in a fictitious post-9/11 America, where a group of untrained young heroes are held responsible after a confrontation with a group of supervillains leaves hundreds of people dead, many of them children from a nearby school, an entire neighborhood in Stratford, Connecticut completely destroyed. In response to the catastrophe, the government passes the Superhuman Registration Act, or SRA, forcing heroes to register their real identities and abilities on a list administered by the US government. The passing of the SRA causes a division in the superhero community, with heroes supporting and disagreeing with the new law, displaying a violent conflict that mirrors the fighting over the same ideas that were present in post-9/11 war on terror America. In fact, it's this mistrust of Americans in their country's safety, as they have started to question if the government authorities had done everything in their power to prevent the events of 9/11 from happening. The trust in superheroes in Civil War fictitious US also disappears after Stanford, as Tony Stark mentions in the first panel, when he says that they had started taking us for granted, started seeing us as familiar, relying on us to help them instead of hoping we would. Just as the US foreign and national security policies had, prior to 9/11, received only praise and support from the American people, now were increasingly criticized. People's perception of heroes changes as rapidly after the incident at Stanford, with the public moving from a complete support of the heroes to publicly demand their detention. In this sense, Stanford becomes another ground zero, not only in terms of destruction and casualties, but also in terms of political response, as Tony Stark mentions in the second panel. The catastrophic consequences of Stanford finally urged the US government to pass the SRA, promoting the general feeling that the event had to be revenge, instead of focusing on the causes behind the attack. As Captain America mentions at one point, everyone seems to forget that the new wearers didn't create that explosion. The mass murderer named Nitro did, a fugitive they were trying to stop, mentioning how the focus was on heroes rather than on the villain that caused the explosion. Society's fixation with heroes' accountability, even when the damage resulting from one of their interventions is from an enemy, is not new, as shown by Director of SEALs Maria Hill, fictitious law enforcement agency. When she remains in these panels, she remembers a conversation with an agent when he said that it was Spider-Man's fault that one of his enemies, the Green Goblin's evil plans continue to happen, as it is his fault that the guy is still alive. He mentions, here the generally praised performance of the hero is problematized as the fundamental correctness of the inner directed morality of the hero is called into question. If the hero's morality pushes him or her to break the law in order to uphold it, why not go even farther and eliminate the threat permanently? The answer is simple, because the hero's morality, although based on the systematic violation of the law, is directly linked to the respect for the due process of it, and the respect for the rights of all citizens, including those that are criminals. The problem is thus not so much on heroes' actions, as they constitute an important part of the country's system of defense, but on the inner directed morality of the hero that guides those actions. And so Stanford becomes the perfect excuse to finally regulate and gain control over the superhero's actions, as Captain America denounces in these panels, when saying that superhero needs to stay above that stuff, or Washington starts telling us who the supervillains are. While Captain America accepts the premises of the new law, having worked alongside S.H.I.E.L.D. for years, he believes in the right of his fellow brothers and sisters in arms to decide for themselves. Because in fact, it is the SRA that would widely allow authorities to repress by law all superhumans, forcing them to become the state's slaves. And in this sense, the altruistic character of the hero would end up being as limited and controlled as the work of a federal or a corporate employee, which is precisely what the hero's what the problem from the point of view of the hero, as Spider-Man mentions in this panel, when saying that most superheroes never asked for these powers, never wanted them, but once they had them, they knew that they had to do what was right in a system that would never allow them to operate openly. While Civil War's events pushes heroes to question themselves about why and for what they fight, it also brings to the Americans' attention the dangers of complying with authorities when they introduce new policies that entail the limitations of people's rights and liberties, even in the name of national security, as Amitai Etzioni exposes in his work How Patriotic is the Patriot Act. He mentions how democracies are precisely dosed when the government, first in the name of national security or some other such cause, streams on rights, which raises literal alarm at the time, and then continues with a few other rights that are curtailed, and soon more rights are lost, and gradually the entire institutional structure in which democracy rests tumbles down the slope with nobody able to stop it. Etzioni exposes here the danger behind all these new policies that limit the rights and liberties of individuals, and how in this sense, it is in the sense that democratic societies such as the US had already adopted oppressive measures before 9/11 that were typical or were more linked to the totalitarian regimes such as Nazism in the 1940s. These measures are also commonly related to what Michael Foucault defines as the carceral society. He mentions how the central institutions that have come to define Western modernity have been based on the model of the prison. Factories, schools, hospitals, mental institutions, and government bureaucracies form an immense virtual network, rigorously document and regulate the individual subject. Pre-9/11 United States had already presented some of these characteristics of the carceral spaces in the form of personal identification, background checks, or even monitoring of public and private areas through security cameras. The use of these methods of control and supervision had prompted individuals to internalize a sense of discipline in their everyday activities that was only reinforced after policies such as the Patriot Act were approved. These circumstances also relate to the growing militarization of the American society, which after 9/11, which Henry A. Giroux exposes in his work, mentioning how as military values, ideology, and a hyper-masculine aesthetic begin to spread into other aspects of the American culture, citizens are recruited as foot soldiers in the war on terrorism, urged to spy on their neighborhoods' behaviors, watch for suspicious-looking people, and supply data to the government. And just as Americans were foot soldiers or became foot soldiers in post-9/11 war on terror America, superheroes or registered superheroes are also pressed to reveal the identities of those friends who refuse to register, as Tony Stark demands here. Evoking the dark era of McCarthyism, superhumans are required to betray and expose their friends and then detain them, to arrest them. This is a significant feature of the carceral society in which individuals are constantly observed and controlled as this monitoring can be conducted by anyone. Their submission to the existing law is permanently ensured, no matter how unfair or discriminated it may be. In this context, the election of Captain America as the symbol of the resistance becomes key, as the famous soldier who had defended the nation and its values back in the 1940s becomes in the Civil War the leader of the resistant heroes fighting against the USRA. The figure of Captain America has always reflected that of the American hero, a person who dedicates his or her life to the defense of the US and its most defining values, as Dittman exposes in this following quote. As Captain America, thus the American ideal, is patriotic without being a government stooge. He is a self-made, rich individual who still cares about his community and country, and he's willing to stand up for what he believes, but is ultimately defensive of the status quo. Captain America is thus the figure that better represents the American identity of the self-made, resilient individual who is willing to sacrifice him or herself defending the country and its beliefs. Well, Steve Rogers, the man behind the mask, had to renounce in the past to the Captain America identity when refusing to agree with the government's actions. He certainly cannot ignore the violation of heroes' rights and liberties now that the FSRA promotes as Captain America. As the public, he believes, has the right to ask for new measures to increase the national security, but never at the expense of people's rights, especially if this limitation is happening on the basis of their social status, religion, origin, or in this case, abilities. Steve's alter ego represents the anti-registration heroes not because he is against the register, but because he believes in the right of those who are affected by it to dissent and to say no to the cause that they do not support. Captain America portrays in this sense what Thoreau introduced in his work on civil disobedience when he defended the right of revolution to resist the government when its tyranny and its inefficiency are great and unendurable. While Thoreau admitted that the law is to be respected, he recognized the possibility and also the obligation to refuse observing it when it's unjust, when it's not fair. This is precisely what the United States was based on, as Steve Rogers reminds Agent 13 here in this panel, while saying that it was not that the country's foundation was not based on the rule of law, but on the breaking the law because the law was wrong. Being the hero that better symbolizes the American identity, beliefs, and most defining values, he recognizes the duty to disobey when the rights and liberties that many Americans had fought for in the past are threatened, even if the cause of the threat is the American government itself, as he reminds Spider-Man in this panel when saying that it is the hero's obligation to say, no, you move, when they are asking them to move. His message is clear: no person or government has the right to restrict anyone else's freedom, much less to obtain personal benefit, and when it happens, it is their individual and collective responsibility as heroes to fight it. This is what his uniform that represents the American flag represents, and what the United States was founded on. In this sense, Millar and McNiven's decision to put Captain America as the face of the heroes' anti-registration movement proves symbolic in the midst of an increasingly militarized society. Being a soldier since the early 20th century and having lived a long life fighting for America, putting him on the other side, fighting against America, but still defending its most defining values, and fighting also against the corporate bureaucrat that is Tony Stark, Iron Man, is greatly significant. The contrast captures the essence of the internal conflict in both Americas, the real and the fictional, as corporations and politicians make use of the social unrest to promote their own personal goals while meeting very little public resistance. Although civil war presents itself as a conflict in which only one side can win, the confrontation ends with neither side claiming the victory. While Captain America surrenders while winning the physical fight during the final battle, Iron Man seems to win the ideological one, only for him to become the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and promote the public amnesty for all heroes. This way, from the beginning to the end of the conflict, neither side is displayed as fully right or fully wrong, as both the pro and anti-registration heroes win and lose at the same time. The conflict's conclusion is in fact hinted at by the question, whose side are you on, which appeared in nearly all the issues, they covered all the issues of the series, and was also used for the promotion of the Marvel event. This single question prompts readers to engage deeply with the hero's conflict and to choose among the two sides, but it also encourages them to open their eyes to the issues at hand in the real America. Thus, for instance, by publicly unmasking heroes in Marvel's fictitious US, the authors attempt to show Americans how the dangers behind about the dangers behind the loss of privacy promoted by the Patriot Act, for instance. Yet, although the author's intention is to denounce the reality behind the new social and political landscape, the constant presence of the question directly deals with the possibility and the right for readers to support either side in both conflicts. What matters is not so much the reader's choice, but the reasoning behind it. Civilians, whether on the real or the fictitious America, become thus key to the story's development and message. Not only are readers invited to directly engage with the conflict, but they are also introduced in the story as a group of civilians. It is a group of civilians who finally stop Captain America during the final battle. This sudden intrusion into the battleground is what brings Steve Rogers to finally surrender while winning the physical conflict. It is thus thanks to the support of the ordinary Americans that Steve realizes that they have lost sight of what they were originally fighting for, as he mentioned in these panels, the right and duty to protect Americans. The conflict had clouded their minds, he believes, so much so that they had inadvertently renounced to their responsibility towards the people in order to fight themselves for their own personal interests. This is why, as he no longer represents what this uniform does, Captain America takes off his mask one more time and is finally arrested as Steve Rogers. With these panels, Millar and McNiven imply that although Steve still represents the defense of the Americans' right to fight for what they believe in and for their freedom, the US does not anymore, and so he can no longer wear the uniform that symbolizes the America that is now lost. This pessimistic view, however, is opposed by the introduction of the group of civilians in the heroes' fight, as the author's way to express that there is still hope for the country, and it is in the hands of the people to change its course. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.